Hey everyone, Oisty T here from Good Evening Eorzea, and I'm here to talk to you about the Fanfest interview that Yoshi P did with members of the press at the Tokyo Fanfest. Gamerscape have put together the NA and EU translation of it, so thank you to them. The link to the actual article will be posted in my video below, and obviously thank you to Gamerscape, and all information in there does belong to Gamerscape as well. I'm doing this video because there were a couple of answers that did kind of jump out at me, and I just wanted to sort of like talk about them a bit more because it's not normally something I would do on a video. I'd never normally go through one of these, but reading through this, it did kind of sort of like bring some things to my attention that I would like to talk about. So we'll just go through bits of it. So to begin with, they ask about how it was finishing the first day of FanFest. I didn't realize they still do have the Chinese and Korean FanFest to actually go through after Shadowbringers is released, but I'm guessing that's because they play on servers that get this information late. But about 50% of the work, he says, is done, so there's nothing for him to go through there. They do talk about the Crystarium because, or the Crystorium, because it does look like a lot of the stuff from the tech demo for 2005's E3 Final Fantasy 14 1.0, and a lot of those comparisons have already been drawn. It does look very, very similar, and they've talked about that. At the time, they wanted to go and talk about the developers panel the following day, but they did use a lot of the same aspects, and they did look back to 1.0 to see how much they needed to put in terms of that. He kind of confirmed that Dex will be the main staff for a dancer, which is what we were expecting. They did turn around and ask if, now that there's 4 jobs using Dex as the primary stat, whether or not there was any plans to go back and change Ninja's main stat to strength, and possibly put that in with the gear that a monk and a samurai shares, or even if they really wanted to, the armor that a dragoon shares. Or Dragoon uses, because Dragoon currently doesn't share its gear with any other job. They have turned around and said they can't say much before the middle of May. If they were to talk about one part of the entire battle system revamp, people would then start talking about it. Especially with the current internet-driven society, one change may lead to big misunderstandings, big presumptions, which are then hard to correct. Which is kind of what happened in terms of Dancer being a healer. The big presumption was that because we were getting Gunbreaker as a tank, we would then get a healer to go with it, and that's one of the things that they ask about later. So the question was, I think a lot of people were able to predict that Dancer was coming, but for it to be a ranged DPS was a surprise. Since the Gunbreaker is a tank, a lot of people thought that the next job would be a healer. Can you please give an explanation of why you decided on a tank and a ranged DPS? So it was quite a detailed answer. So they did have suggestions about putting in healer, but they didn't necessarily think that Dancer would be a healer. When they think about the expansions, they look at what roles to give the new jobs, because that's how players experience the game. So their priority is how people experience the game. They were quick to decide on a tank because the balance wasn't quite right. They see tanks as having 2 roles, the main tanks and the off tanks, so to have an odd number of tank jobs, and he again stresses the hypothetical nature of what he says next, that they are wanting to try and divide them into 2 jobs that are really good at main tank and 2 jobs that are really good at off tanking, but at times can perform the other role as well. So it would result in having 1 tank that was really good as a main tank, or 2 tanks that were really good as a main tank and 1 as an off tank, or vice versa. If they then try and balance the jobs around those roles, any difference would lead to one overtaking the other. So if you've got a fixed main tank and then the other 2 are off tanks, if one of them, so say for example Paladin, was performing slightly better than what a Dark Knight was, if they were the 2 off tanks, then the meta and the community would lean towards it being Warrior for main tank, Paladin for off tank, because it's slightly better than a Dark Knight for that off tank role. So because there's 3 jobs, it's difficult not to have a 1 versus 2 relation. They wanted to put the extra tank in so that you could have 2 main tanks, 2 off tanks, and then try and balance the 2 groups against one another. Also, they said that Gunblade is one of the main symbols of Final Fantasy, so they wanted to add it into the online game to try and give the interest to people who haven't yet gone on to 14. When they then looked what job to add in, they had two candidates. So they had a ranged DPS job as well as a healer. So because they have difficulties balancing the current 3 healer jobs, they decided not to go with another healer. Just due to a Scholar's Fairy, it's inevitable for it to exceed the other jobs. So Scholar always exceeds Astro and White Mage because there's technically 2 healers on the field. So they're racking their brains with how to balance White Mage, Astrologian and Scholar around each other at the moment. And even if they did rebalance them by adding in another healer, it would be more difficult to balance everything out because they've got barrier healers and pure healers, but that division isn't as clear as main tank and off tank. So rather than only focusing on balancing the 3 healer jobs, we decided to sort out the number of jobs in each role. So by the time that they did that, they decided on Dancer, and they decided on it being a ranged DPS. Is the style of gameplay similar to that of the Final Fantasy XI Dancer? Completely different design. They have said it's similar, but at the time it isn't. So it has the taste of Final Fantasy franchise, not only 11. So, for example, they took the Samurai's impression of a warrior from 11 and made it unique into the 14 version that we see by giving it the Ronin wearing a kimono kind of look. So they've kind of done that with Dancer. So they've created a Dancer that's unique to 14, but still has nostalgia in the rest of the Final Fantasy universe. They then asked about animations and the dance moves in general and whether or not they'd be the same for both genders, because Yoshi P did state that. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but they have turned around and said that they've looked at the lore as to why dances are performed. They took world folklore as reference for creating the dancer. So they've tried to make it where the dancers themselves aren't overly amorous or overly sexy in terms of a computer, and that does seem really weird in describing it. So they've tried to make it subtle. They've tried to do the moves themselves as opposed to what the moves actually mean in terms of that. So they've looked more at kind of how the dancers are based in world folklore as opposed to how they actually look. So Tetsuya Nomura is doing some of the designs for the new bosses. They did say that Nomura-san is very, very busy, and he did have time to get the character Gaia designed. And they've then used some of Nomura-san's drawings, so it does kind of create an interest when it comes to 14. So how will Eden fold in with the story? So they didn't say much about the story at JP Fanfest. They did say that it would be slightly tied to the story, so it's about bringing back some of the elements to the first. So the way Yoshida said is think of it as a raid in the first. The core point is that you'll get involved in an even bigger problem in the first. So obviously on the source, the current shard, we had the band called Bahamut, Alexander, Omega, and then they've decided to go back to the basics of Final Fantasy. They've already done it up to level 4, so tier 4, and some of the mechanics have made them turn around and go, wow, what? And they do proudly show Yoshida their work. The next part of it is part of kind of what I wanted to talk about. So return the night, elements, and weather to the first was quite impactful for the JP audience. What they've turned around and said is that when you're completing an area, so when you've done, say, the Lakelands part of the MSQ, the area will get the elements turned back on kind of thing, so you'll become more of a warrior of darkness. And the way that they've turned around and said that is depending on where you are in the main scenario, the way the area will look will change. So for example, in Idleshire, if you have not completed Heaven's Ward, you see a giant rock where Alexander is. Once you complete Heaven's Ward, that rock disappears and Alexander's there. So that that sort of like sets the stage for that. So depending on where you are in the story, will depend on what that area looks like. They said on the main stage of a scenario is the first. Will you be able to come and go freely? You will be able to travel backwards and forwards freely across the interdimensional rift. If you think back to 3.4 and the Warriors of Darkness, in order for them to move from the first to the source, they had to give up their own lives. This time there's going to be a trick intertwined with the main story, and it's not just going to be about the fact that we've got the Echo. So that's going to amplify the way that we actually process. They do sort of like say, is Gil also utilised on the first? What if the first never had Alligans? What happens to Tombstones? There's no Rowena to go and spend them at. And they did say to keep an eye on it. They've tried to use as much lore as possible and come up with the lore. So that if the Allagan Tombstones do become history, what will become of them? What will we start doing? And they have made the lore for that. They really want us to experience another world and the source and connect them all at the same time. And it did create quite a ruckus, according to Yoshi P and the development team. And they did also laugh when they asked what would happen with retainers. They did then talk about the Hrothgar. So they said they wanted to implement a Beastman race. They kind of want to do that, but it's always been kind of something that they've decided on not doing. But when they've went through it, so because they're making a fantasy game, they wanted to give an aspect to the beast kind of races. And this time the motive wasn't. This time the motive was the voices of the players talking about wanting lupins, which were one of the races in 4.0 that we saw with NPCs, but we weren't able to play as. So with the current resources they had, they could only add one race, and they decided to do a beautiful female and then a beast man, which is why we got the female Viera and the male Hrothgar. That's why they wore the shirt. I haven't seen many videos talking about it, but I know in my Discord chat I did immediately point out the shirt to the rest of my free company, saying that Hrothgar's basically confirmed because he was wearing a shirt, and he said, yeah, it was a hint. So they then just talked about some designs behind the Viera and the Hrothgar and the faces. So if they wanted to make the helmets fit, so they talk about the Viera's ears, they can make them fall sideways, in which case they have to be in the same position as Mkhitaryan's, otherwise it wouldn't actually integrate with the system. So if they don't make new race art and new look, it doesn't make sense to add any. So I decided that it doesn't matter if they can't wear helmets, therefore no matter what helmet you equip, you can equip it, but it won't graphically show. We did decide to enable display of headpieces that hide the entire head. So if you want to wear the fat chocobo head, for example, you can. Glasses and circlets won't be displayed. But if you were to separately decide which item is fine and which isn't, we would have to go for a huge number of items. So they decided to disable the graphics completely and only allow headpieces that hide the entire head. So basically, if you are a Viera or Hrothgar and you wear something that doesn't hide the entire head on your head, that will not be displayed. Is there a possibility some NPCs will wear glasses? They'd probably try and stop anybody who would try and do that, because people would turn around and go, well, NPCs can, why can't I? And just judging by the way that the community have reacted to the no healer announcement and the Hrothgar being male only and the female Viera being female only, I don't think that's something that they want to do again. They may get some leeway to do something later, but it would be based on budget and experience. They decided to make Viera and Hrothgar about 3 months after the release of 4.0. That's when it was decided Viera was 100% the next race. That's so that they could tell Matsuno-san that if he wanted to put Fran in the Return to Evil's raid, he could. Hrothgar was decided at the same time. After thinking if we should implement the female version of Hrothgar or just put in Viera, ultimately that's when they decided on Viera. Around the time is when they started making the same races. The head characteristics are quite unique, so the differences of choices between faces is quite big. Lion, leopard, you can change the face really drastically on a Hrothgar, and right before the EU Fan Festival is when they made the Viera's fixed model, and Hrothgar's not that long ago. that's when they talked about. They then went and talked about the tribes and the different beastmen, and obviously beastmen on the source is derived from the fact that Garlemald calls the different tribes beastmen. However, Garlemald doesn't exist in the first. However, they did answer that by the fact that in Japanese the word Banzuko exists, and Banzuko is barbarian or savage tribe. In the JP client, the word is used for beastmen. So in the same fashion, in the first standard language, they're called Banzuku rather than people. So they're the Banzuku race. So they're the beastman race. And they did then highlight in the law book when and which race started to be called as beastmen, which was influenced by the period and politics. If the period and world are different, even if they're the same beings that are made from ether, they might be called beastmen. Or in the opposite scenario, they might call everyone else beastmen. So, for example, if Garleans start to rule everything in the source, they might start calling everyone except for Garleans as beastmen, because it's based on the period and the politics. Will the beastmen from the first summer primals? He wonders. Since we're talking about a world that's been split, it's a broken world, so that there's a chance of crystals, ether, and that there may be a chance of summoning a primal, and that may materialize. Lore-wise, it is possible, but he didn't say whether or not in 5.0 they would. We saw all the plump Makotes. Will the players be able to come like that? They haven't been able to do anything in terms of actually making the characters, player characters be able to do that. However, they have advised that the characters in the cutscene, so you've got those three characters there, the three fat cats, they are part of the main scenario quest. So after that, give them feedback. You never know, we might be able to kind of get the fat cat NPC model, player character model. I have seen some people joke about if you gave one of them the red mage job stone, give them a baguette and a glass of wine as the crystal, which I do think would be quite funny as an actual image. About dwarves of a helmet being designed based on the previous dwarves. Yes, one day when everyone becomes good friends, you may be able to wear the helmets. So basically kind of confirming that when you get max rank with dwarves, you will be able to get the armor set that will have a helmet and beard on there. High chance of Lalafell or dwarfs dailies, because they are a tribe, so you will have beastmen dailies. They're going to have different factions within the tribe, so they'll have different competitive stances towards one another, and it might look like a kid's fight from our point of view. So you might be the person who'll have to put out the fires, try and make things go well. Something like that may get released in the future. They try and put a lot into it when they made them. There were a lot of SNS, I'm not too sure what they are, saying that the white mage from the first Lamimi didn't have a helmet or beard. There is a reason for that, and they are filling the holes in terms of the lore around that, because that is one of the things that did come out. Then just talked about a little bit more about the dwarves. So if you go in as a Lalafell, will you have the highest rank from the get-go? You don't have the head, the beard and the helmet. Characteristics of Lalafell houses. They described in 4.0 in the Azim Steps a lot of lore and information about how the Aurvar live. So that's what they want to do in terms of Lalafells in the first in 5.0. Houses will not have... Dwarf houses won't have missions inside of them, so you will not be stopped from progressing. They did say that Rothgar, if you were to straighten the spine and stand up straight, they would be taller than a Rogadin. The skin is quite smooth for Beastmen. Will you be able to make them hairier? They did say it's going to be difficult, but they need a better display engine. And they have advised that there is a fluffy engine in the 5th business division, but if we were to displaying 3 characters would freeze the game, so they can't really put the fur in there. They then talk about the size of new areas. When adding all the areas together, it definitely won't be narrower than Stormblood. Rather, it's a little bit bigger. They're more concentrated as well. So the new stage, Northrend, is, when in speaking in terms of the source, is Eorzea. So Northrend is the size of Eorzea, and the areas of the 3 nations are equivalent to Northrend. That doesn't make sense, but okay. Therefore, think of it as Eorzea areas equals Northrend areas. So the inside volume of Eorzea in the source is the volume of Northrend in the first. Due to the flood of light, areas outside of Northrend have vanished, and their current state is a pure white vast land, which is called the Land of the Emptiness. Yep, that definitely doesn't sound like we're going there. You can actually see it on the fields. To give a short answer, if you look at the art of Amareng, which is this one here, so that, I'm guessing, is the wall wave kind of structure, and that's the boundary of the flood of light that barely came to a stop at that spot. So that is the Land of the Emptiness. So they ask, will Eden take place in the Land of the Emptiness? I wonder. That's kind of making me believe, yep, Eden is going to be taking place in the Land of the Emptiness. You are going to be able to use your mount. You'll be spreading darkness in new areas. They were thinking about different types of movement modes, so they were thinking, could we do anything really? And there isn't really anything else that they can do. So they have thought about how to implement flying more in the zones as opposed to what other types of movement could be done. So lastly, the core element of Shadowbringers is reconstructing the world. So like always, everything's rooted in the main story. Same goes for the trust system. Whenever they talk about expansions, they want to expand on the volume of an entire new RPG. They put effort into the RPG elements, which are not usually characteristic to MMOs, such as inlaying the scenario into the world where you can do it alone. So if you think of things like WoW, where the scenario does take place inside that world, I would say that Final Fantasy XIV has 100 times better story than what World of Warcraft does, because they put so much of that RPG side of it into an MMORPG. You could quite easily play Final Fantasy XIV as a standalone single player Final Fantasy game apart from the leveling dungeons. If you ignore those, it's definitely a solid single player RPG, whereas you couldn't really do that with World of Warcraft. So they do put the elements of the RPG in, and they are hoping that the RPG elements will be a core element of Shadowbringers, or at least that's what I took away from it. That was the last question that Yoshi P answered during that interview. So thank you to the people that did put this out. Like I say, it was Gamerscape. They did a great job getting that translated and putting it all out there. Thank you to them. Like I say, the link for the actual article will be in my description below. And thank you for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, goodbye.